First, a recap. In previous lectures, we discussed realistic, impressionistic, the use of details, point of view, tone, figurative devices, personification, alliteration, the importance of setting in nonfiction, especially in narrative and autobiographical essays, sensory details in setting, the use of mood, and weaving together your personal life into your writing to give an essay the richness of your own experience. The last lecture in this series about description will be about character and sensation. How do you describe a person in your essay so that this person is believable? How do you communicate the sensations of that person's experience to your reader so that your reader can feel the pulse of your character? How do you transform a character into an emotional being more than just a pile of words? Nonfiction essays typically address several core concerns: ideas, people, and experience. Sometimes an essay will split into two or more of them, but sometimes it will only address one. Nevertheless, all three, ideas, people, and experience, must be introduced to the reader in a tangible, functional way so that the reader, who is also a human, can verify that experience with his or her own life. How should you describe people in your writing? People are complex living organisms. Unlike an object, idea, or place, people are riddled in inconsistency. They are fractious. They are broken. They are both full and empty at the same time. They are on multiple spectrums of reality, and these spectrums are constantly in flux. The most disbelievable person is a caricature, when an idea replaces human experience and removes the richness of one's history while exchanging it for a vapid philosophy. Description fails to accurately present a whole human due to this sheer complexity. What appears to be real in 1 minute fades away in the next. Furthermore, one person wears many hats, and these hats are seen as different hats by others. You may consider yourself a good person, while another person considers you a bad person. You consider yourself a student, but your little brother considers you a big brother or sister, and your mother considers you her child. You could not hope to describe your inner life in a library. That's just how complex you are. So, how could you hope to describe another person accurately? How do you avoid turning that person into a paper-thin facsimile of your own inner desires? The first method of describing a person is obviously appearance. The physical description of a person, especially in a narrative or a biographical essay, is necessary in establishing a baseline for your reader. You have many options for this type of writing. Realistic, impressionistic, and sensory language can be used together to describe the physical appearance and physical experience of a person. Leonard Schechter described the boxer Muhammad Ali as such. Muhammad Ali, shirtless, dressed in jeans and chukka boots, sat in the corner of his blue velvet couch. He ran his hand over his milk chocolate torso, caressing, slapping, pinching the new flesh around his middle. The color television, set into a marble fireplace opposite him in this narrow living room, was tuned to a morning game show. He had used remote control gadgets to turn the sound off, but the animated lollipops on the screen continued their mindless charade. His eyes, big and brown, kept drifting back to the screen. He was talking about how busy he was. As you can hear from that description, the writer was describing Ali during his interview. strictly based on where he was and what he was doing in his interview when the writer visited his home. He described Ali sitting on a couch and watching television during his interview. That's it. Nothing more. But the description of the writing is telling and shows an entirely different side to the boxer than the depiction he normally received when people saw him boxing in fights on television. The second method of describing a person is his physicality. How does he move or stand? What gestures, mannerisms, peculiar traits, and eccentricities does the person exhibit? Quite often, these kinds of descriptions communicate more than physical appearance. In the previous example, you heard Ali running his hand down his chest, rubbing his new belly fat. You pictured in your mind his drifting eyes as he flicked his attention between the television and the interviewer. Here is a further description of Ali. The expression on his face turned to one of bemused pain. His handsome face, unmarked, but for a thin white scar on his left eyebrow, the result of a childhood accident, is as mobile as that of a rubber puppet, and he tugs and twists it to underline emotion. When he is surprised, his eyes pop out of his head and show white all around the pupil. When he is sad, his face collapses and one can almost see the tears forming. When he is happy, his face glows like a pinball machine, and his even white teeth gleam free games. When you are writing fiction or stories, your characters are based on archetypes or conceptual fictional ideas in the journey of a hero or villain. When you are describing real people, on the other hand, you cannot transform that person into a caricature or cartoon. You must try as hard as possible to fully flesh out that person to the best of your ability. As Robin Hemley states, when you write about a real person, especially someone you know quite well, a flood of details will usually hit you, many more than you can possibly use. If the remarkable thing about Uncle Lou was his shoe size, maybe he wore a size 15, make that the detail that types him. Maybe several things made your uncle remarkable. Not only his foot size, but he has an enormous beard, never washed his hair, and wore a greasy Cleveland Indians baseball cap. Perhaps you can get away with using all of those details, but you might have to toss one or two to make him less of a caricature. Which ones would you choose to drop? The third method of describing a person is through intellectual activity, or what that person says, how that person speaks, and what that person believes based on spoken or unspoken behavior. Using quotes from the person you are describing is an excellent way to communicate this kind of behavior. Describing how those words are spoken is another way to parse out intellectual activity. Using anecdotes or small stories about that person's life as context for what is being said is a third way of describing intellectual activity. Again, listen to how Leonard Schechter describes the boxer Muhammad Ali. It's impossible for me to try and have nothing to do, he is saying. I mean, I just don't represent boxing. I'm taking a stand for what I believe in and being 1000% for the freedom of Black people. Naturally, those who have the same fight, but on a smaller scale, they come to me. And he whispers, "You speak for me too, brother. You speak for me too." A few sentences later in the article, Schechter uses an anecdote from Ali's life to provide some context. He was perhaps the best anybody has ever seen because he had the modern athlete's body, as swift as it was large, and no boxer ever had one like it before. But then a sergeant in a Houston Selective Service office asked him to take a step forward. And he refused because he said he was a minister of the Muslim faith in the Nation of Islam. The Boxing Commission revoked his title as heavyweight champion of the world. To provide proper context regarding a person, however, requires research. You will need to rigorously read everything you can find about the person you are describing in your essay. As Hemley instructs, know something about the era, know something about the person. Go to the library and look at the microfilm of newspaper articles about the person you're writing about. Read biographies about the person, not just one, but 2 or 3. Biographers don't necessarily agree with one another, so you can usually get a couple of different perspectives by reading more than one. And then you can decide which is the most accurate. The writer Alan Lightman described Albert Einstein in his novel Einstein's Dreams as, in some distant arcade, a clock tower calls out 6 times and then stops. The young man slumps at his desk. He has come to the office at dawn after another upheaval. His hair is uncombed, and his trousers are too big. In his hand, he holds 20 crumpled pages, his new theory of time, which he will mail today to the German Journal of Physics. Now, obviously, you can tell from this description that this is an imaginative piece about Einstein. Lightman isn't trying to paint an accurate, realistic image of young Einstein mailing his paper on relativity to the journal. Lightman doesn't know. No one knows what that experience was like because Einstein never really addressed it. This is an impressionistic piece of writing where Lightman, who is trying to explore the importance of Einstein's character to the world, attempts to show the humanity of the man behind the caricature of the mad scientist who developed the nuclear bomb and rewrote the laws of physics. It's an evocative description of a real person who did a real thing and had a real impact on the world. How do you then begin the process of doing this research? Glenn Evans, author and editor of The Complete Guide to Writing Nonfiction, is very clear about the attitude you must take when doing research. Research, according to Evans, responds to 4 key principles. Number 1, interviewing. Number 2, observing. Number 3, reading. And number 4, reasoning. Interviewing, as Evans states, can be both orally and in correspondence, while observing is done personally, such as visiting a location, experiencing something yourself, or observing an event take place either in person or virtually. Reading is an absolute prerequisite to doing research and cannot be understated. And so, reasoning is then taking the information you gain from personal encounters and reading, then coordinating that information together. Alden Todd, in his book, Finding Facts Fast, How to Find Out What You Want and Need to Know, describes reasoning as concluding what must have happened or what must be the case now from facts we have learned by other means. Reasoning from the known to the unknown in research is best used as a method that leads to new documents and sources, and therefore to finding more than standard bibliographies and other sources have provided. It is a method that should be used from the beginning in drawing up a research plan in order that the most likely sources are covered before those that are merely sources. It was only after wasting considerable time in research for my own professional writing that I discovered the importance of thinking through a research project and planning in general lines before digging in. The beginner often makes the mistake of rushing to the first possible source of information that occurs to him, when he should take a few minutes to consider several possible sources, then choose carefully the best order in which to follow them. The careful method of doing research will be helpful to you in all aspects of writing, not only in defining who a person is that you are writing about, but the whole process of researching your topic. The second topic for this lecture is about sensation and exemplification. In a previous lecture, we discussed at length how to incorporate sensory language into your writing. To review, sensory language involves the 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. When writing descriptions, language that evokes the 5 senses can be useful in orientating your reader towards a certain outcome you wish to achieve. However, one aspect we did not address was how to use imagery in a way that achieves trust with your reader. In a later lecture, we will discuss at length the concept of sophistry. Sophistry, which comes from the sophists of ancient Greece, is an art of rhetoric which compels the observer or receiver through manipulation of emotion. In ancient Greece, sophists were an integral part of the Greek democratic institution, a much older form that hardly resembles 21st century democracy in any way. In Greek democracy, citizens, an elite class, someone with power, influence, and money, would lobby for their own interests in a common congress of their peers. And to sway their peers to their side, they would hire sophists who would play on the emotions of other citizens and legislators, distorting the truth and using any trick in the book to achieve a desired end. The Greek philosopher Plato not only despised the sophists, but he also despised poets, because he believed that poets were a form of literary sophistry who used imagery and sensation to trick the reader or auditor into a certain alien emotion previously unrealized, an emotion that would depart just as soon as it arrived. According to Brett McAnally and Dennis Perry in their book Writing and Rhetoric, Plato believed that sophists and poets relied on linguistic trickery. While in Plato's day, most would not read a document. Rather, auditors or audience would listen to an argument. So sophistry used rhyme, rhythm, diction, onomatopoeia, and other alliterative devices, in addition to visceral and savage sensory language directly attacking base emotions to win the argument. I am introducing this to you because while the power of sensation in language is powerful, it can be both overused and abused, meaning the writer can overuse sensory language and then overwhelm the reader, or the writer can abuse sensory language in unethical ways, such as tricking a reader to see something as beautiful when it is absolutely evil, or playing with the reader's emotions to deceive the reader. I'd like to read for you an example of an excellent use of sensory language in the development of an argument that doesn't seek to deceive, but merely to inform. This was written by Herbert Gold in 1962 in his book, The Age of Happy Problems, in which Gold is trying to describe problems in modern society with overconsumption. Here, he is describing the turtle harvesting industry. So, if this is triggering for you, I encourage you to skip ahead to my explanation. The description takes around 1 minute and 15 seconds, or around 75 seconds. So skip ahead if you know this will bother you. Before being killed and canned, the turtles swim in dense crawls, bumping each other in the murky water, armor clashing, dully lurching against high pens. Later, trussed on a plank dock, they lie unblinking in the sun, their flippers pierced and tied. The tough leather on their skins does not disguise their present helplessness and pain. They wear thick, sun-hardened accumulations of blood at their wounds. Barbados turtles, as large as children, They belong to a species which has been eliminated locally by ardent harvesting off the waters near Key West. But the commercial tradition still brings them here to be slaughtered. Crucified like thieves, they breathe in little sighs. They gulp. They wait. At a further stage, in the room where the actual slaughtering occurs, the butchers stride through gore in heavy boots. The visitor must proceed on a catwalk. A misstep will plunge him into a slow river of entrails and blood. Gould's argument is clear. He uses extremely brutal language to argue that the turtles are defenseless in their deaths. He ascribes an innocence to the turtles, a spiritual loss in the killing, and a cruel ritualistic mutilation of these poor creatures. There are some analogies that Plato might object to and say Gould is attempting unfairly to ascribe to the turtles a humanity that, as turtles, they neither asked for nor deserved. But you cannot reject the notion that Gould's masterful use of language evokes a sense of tragedy that acutely parallels the central thesis in his book about overconsumption in the modern world. The use of sensation can make or break your argument. If you overuse it, your reader will become lethargic, apathetic, and bored of your writing. If you abuse it, the reader will distrust your intentions. If you underuse it, your reader will remain unconnected to your argument and stay unemotionally involved. As a writer, it is not only your prerogative, but your objective to attach an emotional draw to your writing, because most readers not only expect this, but are disappointed when an emotional connection is missing. How do you choose what examples to use to best exemplify or illustrate your argument? The concept of exemplification is important in writing. Had Herbert Gould described the turtles as pieces of pasta rather than children, your emotional connection would have been severed from the seriousness of his topic. You would have immediately fled the scene and walked away from his argument, maybe even wondering if he seriously believed in anything at all, or if he was just a comedian playing a trick on you. As we explored in an earlier lecture in The Star, every argument you make in a piece of writing must be accompanied by an example. Exemplification is the art of not only choosing a correct and proper example, but how to describe that example in your writing. Choosing an example for each of your main points is as serious as making a move in a game of chess. Your move must be the best possible move in the game up until that point. And each move or example must be strategically in line with every move you have previously made and will make in the future. Besides using sensory images and narrative particulars, which we will discuss in a later lecture, that is, narrative particulars, we can describe three kinds of exemplification. Firstly, singular exemplification, which stand apart and are independent of other examples. Secondly, extended exemplification, which are composed of two or more examples loosely or strongly related to one another. And thirdly, cumulative exemplification, in which the examples build on each other and grow into a more complete picture by the end of the writing. Examples must always move readers beyond generalizations into particularities. You should utilize everything you've learned so far in the writing of examples: details, settings, sensations, character, auditory visual forms such as alliteration. George Orwell wrote his essay, Such Were the Joys, in which he discussed the nature and necessity of education and how education should change in the future. He begins. I have good memories of St. Cyprian's among a horde of bad ones. Sometimes on summer afternoons, there were wonderful expeditions across the downs to a village called Burling Gap, or to Beachy Head, where one bathed dangerously among the chalky boulders and came home covered with cuts. And there were still more wonderful midsummer evenings when, as a special treat, we were not driven off to bed as usual, but allowed to wander about the grounds in the long twilight, ending up with a plunge into the swimming bathe at about 9 o'clock. There was the joy of waking early on summer mornings and getting in an hour's undisturbed reading. Ian Hay, Thackeray, Kipling, and H.G. Wells were the favorite authors of my boyhood. In the sunlit, sleeping dormitory. There was also cricket, which I was no good at, but with which I conducted a sort of hopeless love affair up to the age of about 18. And there was the pleasure of keeping caterpillars. The silky green and purple puss moth, the ghostly green poplar hawk, the privet hawk, large as one's third finger, specimens of which could be illicitly purchased for 6 pence at a shop in the town, and when one could escape long enough from the master who was taking the walk, there was the excitement of dredging the dew ponds on the downs for enormous newts with orange-colored bellies. This business of being out for a walk, coming across something of fascinating interest and then being dragged away from it by a yell from the master, like a dog jerked onwards by the leash, is an important feature of school life and helps to build up the conviction, so strong in many children, that the things you most want to do are always unattainable. Notice a few things from Orwell's essay. Firstly, his use of concrete details, such as bathed dangerously among the chalk boulders, which creates a nervousness that the boulders might suddenly fall apart like chalk and collapse into the waves. Or, in the sunlit sleeping dormitory, which shows a childlike innocence, as students might kick their feet up in the afternoon rays of the sun and disappear into a book. Or the silky green and purple puss moth, which is an extraordinary way to describe, well, an insect that normally you might be scared out of your wits and jump up and down with your shoe to kill, but in this instance is used as a kind of dreamlike trance where little children become budding entomologists and dream of collecting scintillating, beautiful carapaces to line the walls of their wood-paneled offices. But what if you want to use examples that don't rely on literary and sensory techniques to make your argument? What if you just want to write a simple argument and need a relatively simple example to prove your point? There is still an art to exemplification, even if you aren't whistling your words into music for your reader's pleasure. You still need functional and interesting descriptions. As a writer, you need to also make sure your examples not only paint poignant pictures with emotional language, but also that you have numbers, statistics, facts, and real-world cases. You need quotes from experts in the field. You need to paraphrase important ideas from authors who wrote longer than you have in your essay. And you need to cite both historical and scientific evidence to make your point. Most of all, though, you need to take care with how you write those details so that they not only emotionally appeal to your audience, but smartly tighten your argument and lock your case so that nothing that drips through will break apart your logic. An excellent example of how to use practical exemplification to support an argument comes from the writer Theodore Ziolkowski in his essay, The Existential Anxieties of Engineering. This essay was published in 1984 in the journal American Scholar. Ziolkowski's thesis in his essay is to argue that not only is engineering pleasurable, but engineering needs more poets and artists involved to reduce the anxiety engineers feel from an overemphasis on technology. The essay shows a trend in engineering that is illustrative of Steve Jobs, the creator of the iPhone, who was another engineer who believed that technology and science had to be innovative and spiritual, meeting physical, intellectual, and spiritual needs, that engineering needed to be more than just pure utility and progress. See if you can trace Ziolkowski's argument in this short passage from his essay, The Essential Anxieties of Engineering, Existential Anxieties of Engineering. Novels portraying the moral anxiety of engineering did not cease to be written after World War I, of course. Literary genres do not disappear so quickly. Some 30 years later, Frederick Philip Grove's Master of the Mill recapitulates all the characteristics of the genre. In this powerful Canadian classic, the engineer Samuel Clarke learns that his family's milling empire, which supplies 90% of all the nation's flour, was founded by a criminal act of his father. Clarke is unsuccessful in his efforts to assume the responsibility, to compensate for the crime by social welfare, and to protect his own son from the inherited guilt. His plans for social reform fail. The workers are displaced by technology, and his son is shot during a strike of the enraged millers. By the time Clarke dies, he realizes that the great pyramidal mill of 17 stories had always ruled his destiny and determined his every action. The history of the mill had been his history, as much so as the submarines, tunnels, and bridges of the earlier novels. Having destroyed its creator and disenfranchised its former workers, it survives as a symbol of the engineer's moral anxiety. Ziolkowski exemplifies the plight of the modern engineer by comparing a novel written about an engineer from a previous time who also felt an anxiety of meaning in his profession. However, he does so not only by telling the story of an engineer, telling the story of his family's rise and fall, but also by pointing the reader towards a novel that perfectly exemplifies Ziolkowski's thesis. He also didn't use any sensory, figurative, or alliterative language, and presented the story as just an example of one of the points he was trying to make in his essay, while keeping the reader interested in the human element. Using sensory, figurative, or alliterative language in this example would have felt odd, perhaps even uncalled for. Ziolkowski would have been seen as a writer trying to use his language prowess to take away from the potency of his own examples. Here are some final thoughts for you as we conclude this lecture. One of the best methods to learn how to use exemplification in your own writing is to train yourself to observe the exemplification technique other authors use in their essays. Once you have recognized the thesis of an essay, you can then distinguish what the points of the essay are, and finally can validate the efficacy of exemplification. In other words, after you know what the main idea is, you can identify the author's outline and determine whether the examples are useful or not. Here are some questions to ask yourself as you are reading. What is the author's thesis? Usually, this is found at the beginning of the essay, but sometimes it is found after the hook as a direct statement or an inferred statement. What are the author's main points to prove the thesis? Sometimes this is tricky. if the author has more than 5 paragraphs per section of the paper or chapter, especially. What examples and supporting details does the author use in each of the point paragraphs or point sections? Authors won't always use the same type of example. Sometimes an author will use a direct quote, sometimes a footnote, sometimes a story from another source, sometimes a personal anecdote, and sometimes just personal logical reasoning. How does the author transition from one point to the next point? Sometimes authors will transform a transitional statement into a transitional paragraph. And sometimes those transitions will bleed from the end of one point into the beginning of another point, making it difficult to discern when the transition occurs. What specific kinds of exemplification techniques does the author use? Does the author use concrete sensory details, statistics, or cases? Does the author use quotations, paraphrases, or other footnoted material from primary or secondary sources? Does the author use summaries or cite from historical or scientific evidence? Finally, how has the writer arranged these details? Does the author primarily use one kind of exemplification technique over another? Or is the author more balanced in approach? Does the author succeed in exemplification technique or leave you wanting for more detail? And now, here are some strategies for you to work on as you are writing your own essay. After you define your topic, mark in your outline the places where you will use exemplification. How many examples will you use in your essay? Clearly, this isn't an absolute plan, as writing is a fluid art. You may abridge, remove, or add examples as you are writing. But from the beginning of your effort, you should have a vision for how detailed you want your writing to be and how many examples you believe you can use. Are your examples appropriate for your aim of the paper and appropriate for your audience? Does your thesis support the use of exemplification? Or do you need to change or alter your thesis so that you can more effectively use additional examples? Are you using a variety of sources? Or are all of your citations and examples coming from a small number of sources that offer little variety? Examples of sources could be books, periodicals, other forms of media, statistics, and case studies. It's also important to note that some essays don't call for a variety of sources, but you should be aware of whether your examples reflect a variety of sources or if they don't. Have you shared your examples with friends and classmates to gauge whether those examples effectively reach your audience? Many times, writers choose examples purely based on convenience, when those examples are not actually desired or understood by those who will be reading the essay. Examples must achieve two ends. One, examples should illustrate your ideas. And two, examples should hold the reader's attention. Failure to do both of those at the same time will result in the reader becoming dispassionate towards the writing. Finally, have you applied rhetorical coherence so that your examples are linked together through thematic logic and transitional language? Exemplification is one of the more challenging parts of writing because of the strategic skill required. Today's lecture was about both the use of character in writing as well as the use of exemplification in writing. While character and exemplification are somewhat stratified in fiction writing, as characters are active agents and personified thesis statements to some degree, with exemplification inferred through plot devices. These two concepts are intrinsically linked in nonfiction writing. The use of character in your essay, either as a historical or biographical figure, character from your own life, or a case study, is usually the example used in the technique of exemplification. Knowing how to integrate both into your writing will greatly enhance the emotional consonance of your technique. Good luck with your writing.